That spring the war fled again, though less destructively at first. Arthur had paid gold to Oengus mac Irem, the Irish king of Demetia, to attack the western reaches of Powys and Siluria, and those attacks drained enemies from our northern frontiers. Arthur himself led a warband to pacify western Dumnonia, where Cadui had declared his tribal lands an independent kingdom. But while he was there, Ael's Saxons launched a mighty attack on Geraint's lands. Gofethid, we later learned, had paid the Saxons as we had paid the Irish, and Powys's cash was probably better spent, for the Saxons came in a flood that brought Arthur hurrying back from the west, where he left Kai, his childhood companion, in charge of the fight against Cadui's tattooed tribesmen. It was then, with Ael's Saxon army threatening to capture Duro Cobrivis, and with Gwent's forces occupied against both Powys and the northern Saxons, and with Cadui's undefeated rebellion being encouraged by King Mark of Cernau, that Ban of Benwick sent his summons. We all knew that King Ban had only ever permitted Arthur to come to Dumnonia on condition that he returned to Armorica if Benwick was ever in jeopardy. Now, Ban's messenger claimed, Benwick was in dire danger, and King Ban, insisting that Arthur fulfill his oath, was demanding Arthur's return. The news came to us in Duro Cobrivis. The town had once been a prosperous Roman settlement, with lavish baths, a marble justice hall, and a fine marketplace. But now it was an impoverished frontier fort, forever watching east towards the Saxons. The buildings beyond the town's earth wall had all been burnt by Ael's raiders, and were never rebuilt, while inside the wall the great Roman structures crumbled to ruin. Ban's messenger came to us in what remained of the arched hall of the Roman baths. It was night, and a fire burned in the pit of the old plunge bath, its smoke churning about the arched ceiling, where the wind caught and sucked the smoke out of a small window. We had been eating our evening meal, seated in a circle on the cold floor, and Arthur led Ban's messenger into the circle's centre, where he scratched a crude map of Dumnonia in the dirt, then scattered red and white mosaic scraps to show where our enemies and friends were placed. Everywhere, the red tiles of Dumnonia were being squeezed by the white stone scraps. We had fought that day, and Arthur had taken a spear cut on his right cheekbone. Not a dangerous wound, but deep enough to crust his cheek with blood. He had been fighting without his helmet, claiming he saw better without the enclosing metal. But if the Saxon had thrust an inch higher and to one side, he would have rammed his steel through Arthur's brain. He had fought on foot, as he usually did, because he was saving his heavy horses for the more desperate battles. A half-dozen of his horsemen were mounted each day, but most of the expensive, rare war horses were kept deep in Dumnonia, where they were safe from enemy raids. This day, after Arthur had been wounded, a handful of heavy cavalrymen had scattered the Saxon line, killing their chief and sending the survivors back east. But Arthur's narrow escape had left us all uneasy. King Ban's messenger, a chief called Blethig, only deepened that gloom. "You see," Arthur said to Blethig, "why I cannot leave." He gestured at the red and white scraps. "An oath is an oath," Blethig answered bluntly. "If the prince leaves Dumnonia," Prince Geraint intervened, "Dumnonia falls." Geraint was a heavy, dull-witted man, but loyal and honest. As Uther's nephew, he had a claim on Dumnonia's throne, but he never made the claim, and was always true to Arthur, his bastard cousin. "Better that Dumnonia fall than Benwick," Blethig said, and ignored the angry murmur that followed his words. "I took an oath to defend Mordred," Arthur pointed out. "You took an oath to defend Benwick," Blethig answered. shrugging away Arthur's objection. "Bring the child with you." "I must give Mordred his kingdom," Arthur insisted. "If he leaves, the kingdom loses its king and its heart. Mordred stays here." "And who threatens to take the kingdom from him?" Blethig demanded angrily. The Benoic chieftain was a big man, not unlike Owain, and with much of Owain's brute force. "You?" He pointed scornfully at Arthur. "If you had married Cynwen, there would be no war. If you had married Cynwen, then not only Domnonia, but Gwent and Powys would be sending troops to aid my king." Men were shouting, and swords were drawn, but Arthur bellowed for silence. A trickle of blood escaped from beneath his wound scab, and ran down his long, hollow cheek. "How long," he asked Blethig, "before Benoic falls?" Blethig frowned. It was clear he could not guess the answer, but he suggested 6 months or maybe a year. The Franks, he said, had brought new armies into the east of his country, and Ban could not fight them all. Ban's own army, led by his champion Bors, was holding the northern border, while the men Arthur had left behind, led by his cousin Kiluk, held the southern frontier. Arthur was staring at his map of red and white tiles. 3 months, he said, and I will come, if I can. 3 months. But in the meanwhile, Blethig, I shall send you a war band of good men. Blethig argued, protesting that Arthur's oath demanded Arthur's immediate presence in Armorica. But Arthur would not be budged. 3 months, he said, or not at all, and Blethig had to accept the compromise. Arthur gestured for me to walk with him in the colonnaded courtyard that lay next to the hall. There were vats in the small courtyard that stank like a latrine, but he appeared not to notice the stench. "God knows, Derval," he said, and I knew he was under strain for using the word God, just as I noticed he used the singular Christian word, though he immediately balanced the score. "The gods know I don't want to lose you, but I need to send someone who isn't afraid to break a shield wall. I need to send you." "Lord Prince," I began. "Don't call me Prince," he interrupted angrily. "I'm not a prince, and don't argue with me. I hate everyone arguing with me. Everyone knows how to win this war except me. Melwas is screaming for men. Chudric wants me in the north. Kai says he needs another 100 spears, and now Ban wants me. If he spent more money on his army and less on his poets, he wouldn't be in trouble." "Poets?" "Oh, Innistrieves is a haven of poets," he said bitterly, referring to King Ban's island capital. "Poets. We need spearmen, not poets." He stopped and leaned against a pillar. He looked more tired than I had ever seen him. "I can't achieve anything," he said, "until we stop fighting. If I could just talk to Keenaglas face to face, there might be hope." "Not while Gorfethid lives," I said. "Not while Gorfethid lives," he agreed. Then went silent, and I knew he was thinking of Cynwen and Guinevere. Moonlight came through a gap in the colonnade's roof to touch his bony face with silver. He closed his eyes, and I knew he was blaming himself for the war. But what was done could not be undone. A new peace would have to be made, and there was only one man who could force that peace on Britain, and that was Arthur himself. He opened his eyes and grimaced. "What's that smell?" he asked, noticing it at last. "They bleach cloth here, Lord," I explained, and gestured toward the wooden vats that were filled with urine and washed chicken dung to produce the valuable white fabric like the cloaks Arthur himself favoured. Arthur would usually have been encouraged at such evidence of industry in a decayed town like Durocabrivis, but that night he just shrugged away the smell and touched the trickle of fresh blood on his cheek. "One more scar," he said ruefully. "I'll soon have as many as you, Derval." "You should wear your helmet, Lord," I said. "I can't see right and left when I do," he said dismissively. He pushed away from the pillar and gestured for me to walk with him round the arcade. Now listen, Derval. Fighting Franks is just like fighting Saxons. They're all Germans, and there's nothing special about the Franks, except that they like to carry throwing spears as well as the usual weapons. So keep your head down when they first attack. But after that, it's just shield wall against shield wall. They're hard fighters, but they drink too much, so you can usually outthink them. And that's why I'm sending you. You're young, but you can think, which is more than most of our soldiers do. They just believe it's enough to get drunk and hack away. But no one will win wars that way. He paused and tried to hide a yawn. Forgive me. And for all I know, Derval, Benwick isn't in danger at all. Ban is an emotional man. He used the description sourly, and he panics easily. But if he loses Innis Trebes, then he'll break his heart, and I'll have to live with that guilt too. You can trust Keelook. He's good. Bors is capable. But treacherous. Sagramore spoke from the shadows beside the bleaching vats. He had come from the hall to watch over Arthur. Unfair, said Arthur. He's treacherous, Sagramore insisted in his harsh accent. Because he's Lancelot's man. Arthur shrugged. Lancelot can be difficult, he admitted. He's Ban's heir, and he likes to have things his own way. But then so do I. He smiled and glanced at me. You can write, can't you? Yes, Lord, I said. We had walked on past Sagramore, who stayed in the shadows, his eyes never leaving Arthur. Cats slunk past us, and bats wheeled next to the smoking gable of the big hall. I tried to imagine this stinking place filled with robed Romans and lit by oil lamps, but it seemed an impossible idea. You must write and tell me what's happening, Arthur said, so I don't have to rely on Ban's imagination. How's your woman? My woman? I was startled by the question, and for a second I thought Arthur was referring to Canna, a Saxon slave girl who kept me company, and who was teaching me her dialect that differed slightly from my mother's native Saxon. But then I realized Arthur had to mean Lunette. I don't hear from her, Lord. And you don't ask, eh? He shot me an amused grin, then sighed. Lunette was with Guinevere, who in turn had gone to distant Durnovaria to occupy Uther's old winter palace. Guinevere had not wanted to leave her pretty new palace near Caer-Cadern, but Arthur had insisted she go deeper into the country to be safer from enemy raiding parties. Sansom tells me Guinevere and her ladies all worship Isis, Arthur said. Who? I asked. Exactly. He smiled. Isis is a foreign goddess, Derval, with her own mysteries. Something to do with the moon, I think. At least that's what Sansom tells me. I don't think he knows either, but he still says I must stop the cult. He says the mysteries of Isis are unspeakable, but when I ask him what they are, he doesn't know. Or he won't say. You've heard nothing? Nothing, Lord. Of course, Arthur said rather too forcefully. If Guinevere finds solace in Isis, then it cannot be bad. I worry about her. I promised her so much, you see, and am giving her nothing. I want to put her father back on his throne, and we will. We will. But it will all take longer than we think. You want to fight Diranak? I asked, appalled at the idea. He's just a man, Derval, and can be killed. One day we'll do it. He turned back towards the hall. You're going south. I can't spare you more than 60 men. God knows it isn't enough if Ban really is in trouble. But take them over the sea, Derval, and put yourself under Keelook's command. Maybe you can travel through Durnovaria. Send me news of my dear Guinevere.